Welcome, everyone. Happy to have you here in person and online. If there are any issues online with audio, video, feel free to message in the chat and we'll hope to resolve that as soon as possible. So welcome to the 39th Annual Graduate Research Symposium. My name is Katie Frioli. I'm the grad program coordinator here at the Rubenstein School. I personally have only been here a year, but even I know that this event is typically a lot larger in scale and grandeur and everything. However, tonight's event is all about quality and not quantity. So we have three incredible Masters in Natural Resources students here to present on their research and ongoing work. And you'll notice, if folks did not grab a program, some are in the back. You'll notice some blank pages on the back of that, as well as some pens that you can grab at the entrance. If you'd like to take notes, write down ideas or questions that you have while folks are presenting, because there will be a Q&A portion after each presentation. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you all what questions you have for our presenters. So definitely be keen on thinking of those questions while folks are presenting. Folks online, if you have questions, feel free to submit those via the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and we can perhaps have you speak those aloud to everyone. So with that, just one last reminder for folks to be respectful audience members. Our students here have been working really hard to pull together these presentations and all the work that went into the research they're about to share. So just be respectful of that. And also a note that we'll have a little reception afterwards in the room just back there, the little kitchen area. And we hope you'll stick around and join us for some conversation and appetizers and beverages afterwards. So I also did want to state this display acknowledgement, acknowledging that we here at UVM, this event is happening on our campus, which has long served as the unceded ancestral homeland of the Western Abenaki people. And it's important in our role, both as a school and institution, to recognize and honor these people as the traditional stewards of this land. And also recognize and state our mission to protect and respect these lands through our ongoing work at the Rubenstein School. I also did want to direct folks to landgrabu.org, which, if you haven't checked it out, is a really great resource to learn about land grab institutions like UVM and the impact that they've had on tribal nations, not only Vermont, but across the US as a result of the Moral Land Grant Act and everything involved with that. So I encourage you to check that out after the event. And I'm gonna hand it over to Alan, our interim dean, to share some words of welcome, and then we'll get started with presentations.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. My name is Alan Strong. I'm interim dean of the Rubenstein School. I use he, him, his pronouns. And welcome to all of you to the 39th annual Rubenstein School Graduate Research Symposium. Thank you all for coming. Great to see you all here tonight. And this is, it's really an opportunity here for our students to really showcase their scholarship, showcase their research to the entire community, and really to celebrate the research engine that the graduate students represent in the Rubenstein School. You push us, you ask those pesky why questions, you look at old problems in new ways, and just bring tremendous energy to the work that we do in the Rubenstein School. And for graduate students, a lot of the work that you do really revolves around some of the basics of graduate research. And you're developing your proposal, working out your research methods, you're going out in the field, you're collecting data, you're doing literature reviews, the analysis, et cetera. And these are sort of the tasks that kind of consume you on a daily basis. But hugely important and oftentimes overlooked is how you translate the work that you do to a broader audience, to your colleagues, to the peers, to your peers, to the public. And the impetus for this symposium, I mean, really 39 years ago, was to really create a forum for graduate students to be able to share their work in a friendly, supportive atmosphere, and to get comfortable with public speaking, to get some practice in thinking on your feet when your audience asks questions, and to set the stage for you presenting your work at professional conferences and meetings. So thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing your energy and your enthusiasm to the school, and enjoy the moment. So before I get this rolling, I'd like to first thank Katie for organizing this. Thank you very much. And give Katie Greg Bowden, who's here tonight, is the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Education. Greg, thanks so much for the work you do on behalf of the graduate program. And thanks to all of the faculty who are out there supporting our graduate students in the research lab. And we appreciate all the mentorship and support you give our graduate students. So with that, take it away.
All right. Our first presenter of the night is Rachel Swanwick. Rachel is a second-year master's student, originally from New Jersey. She graduated from Brandeis University in 2015 with a double major in environmental studies and international and global studies. After graduating, she worked as an environmental educator, Forest Service ranger, and research assistant. Her current research interests include understanding the complex relationships that people have with the environment and how these relationships can be understood through intersecting identities and decolonizing of dominant frameworks to enhance problem solving for environmental challenges. When Rachel is not doing research or schoolwork or the million other things that our grad students are up to, Rachel enjoys spending time outside, snowboarding, hiking, and adventuring across New England. With that, Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, so hello, I'm Rachel Swanwick. I'm a master's student in Anthony D'Amato's Silviculture and Applied Forest Ecology Lab, and I'm going to share my master's thesis project with you all. It is called Institutional Barriers to Climate Change Adaptation and Co-Produced Knowledge Systems among State and Tribal Agencies in Present-Day Maine's Forestry Community. I've listed some of my collaborators here, but there have been so many people along the way who've shared their wisdom and guidance with me, so I firstly want to say thank you to everyone that has been working with me. The project would not be possible without them. I also want to give a quick land acknowledgement. This research takes place in what we now call present-day Maine, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. These lands are home to the sovereign people of the Wabanaki tribal nations who've stewarded these lands since time immemorial. These tribal nations include the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac nations. I want to recognize the Wabanaki tribal nations as distinct, sovereign, and legal political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. That's really guided a lot of this work, and we exist on their unceded homelands. And with that, I'm going to get into my research project. So the problem that my research looks to address is grounded in climate change and the proliferation of non-native insects and diseases on present-day Maine's forests. These are projected to cause unprecedented social and environmental impacts. There are a lot of different strategies that are being suggested to address some of these anticipated challenges. Some of these challenges include changes to tree species as suitable climatic zones, so a species no longer being able to thrive in a particular area due to changes in climate. Tree mortality and stress, this can be caused from many factors. One of those is the emerald ash borer. I've put a picture of it up there. It's a non-native pest that is posing a threat to ash trees. Extreme weather patterns, so that whether that's drought, flooding, or freeze-thaw cycles. This down here is an image of a freeze-thaw cycle. So when there is early snow, the ground is not able to freeze after, and this makes it really hard for foresters to go in and harvest forest products, especially in the wintertime. This has been happening more regularly, especially in Maine. And lastly, threats to cultures that rely on sustainable forest production. So this is important because recent research suggests that most adaptation strategies have not been widely adopted, despite the many challenges that we have. And this is a phenomenon known as the adaptation deficit. This is the deficit characterized by a gap between the capacity and the potential for climate change adaptation and the current state of adaptive practices. The adaptation deficit is projected to widen globally, given future worsening climate scenarios. And this will have disproportionately greater impacts on marginalized populations, such as Indigenous peoples, whose cultural integrity, economic vitality, spiritual traditions, and ways of life are deeply tied to ecological systems. I've shown a picture here. This is a collaboration between the University of Maine and the Indian Basket Makers Alliance. And they're working together to try and preserve ash for basket making, which is a traditional practice among the Wabanaki to build these really beautiful baskets. I'll show some of them later on. And because of emerald ash borer, which is threatening ash, they're trying to figure out ways to preserve this. So why is this study significant? In present-day Maine, the Wabanaki Confederacy, also known as the People of the Dawnland, are part of a coalition of tribal nations. There are 5 tribes located in Maine. I have pictured here where they're headquartered. They are the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Penobscot Nation, the Aeration Band of Micmac Indians. So there's the Passamaquoddy Pleasant Point and the Passamaquoddy Indian Township. Those are 2 distinct tribes, and the Penobscot Nation. And for these tribes, forests are really key as they are guided to cope with environmental change. Forests support economic development, harvesting practices, cultural connections through things like storytelling and basket making, pathways for generational knowledge transfer, and traditional subsistence way of life. And there is a longstanding relationship between Wabanaki tribal nations and the state of Maine. The state of present-day Maine has historically played a role in regulating their access to land and natural resources. An example of this is through the state Maine's Implementing Act, which accompanied the federal Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. So initially, this act did give the Wabanaki some rights to the land, but it also did not allow them to be federally governed. So rather, they're governed by the state. And there have been some recent efforts to amend this proposed amendment legislative document 1626, which tries to give more federal sovereignty back to the tribes. This was rejected last year, but there are some efforts now to try and edit this document and amend it for resubmission. But just from that little example, I think you can kind of see that there is a really important longstanding relationship between present-day Maine and the Wabanaki tribal nations. And the sort of discourse and language around this relationship and environmental protection and resource access has been centered on a Western colonial perspective and discourse. So I really liked this quote. This is from Dina Winslow from the Aeration Band of Micmac. She says, the question is the whole adaptation piece of it. And are we going to try and maintain things the way they are right at this moment? Are we going to recognize that things change and move into that whole scenario of what will be changing and how? And I think this kind of grounds a lot of the research, trying to understand that things are changing. How are we going to change? How are we going to adapt? This is a question that a lot of the tribes are asking, and a lot of people who are managing land and forests in Maine are looking to find solutions for. And so given those challenges, my study looks to, and I've called it the Maine Forest Stewards Community Study, aims to serve as a foundation for dialogue and collaboration among state and tribal agencies in present-day Maine over a shared goal to maintain the integrity of forest systems and reduce the adaptation deficit across present-day Maine and Wabanaki Indigenous homelands. This is a really big question, so we've broken this up into 2 main research goals. Those research goals are guided by what is the most frequently cited, one of the most frequently cited barriers to climate change adaptation, which is the role of institutions. And institutions are kind of defined here as the rules, norms, and behaviors that govern how organizations function. So you can think of them like the rules of a game in a society, and how the capacity of agencies based on these institutional rules and norms to implement climate change adaptation strategies is something that I'm looking to understand better. And the ability to enact institutional change to improve climate change adaptation among agencies and the institutional structures they inhabit is an area that's been targeted for future scholarly work. And so that's kind of the basis of the research, trying to understand these institutions. And the first research goal is evaluating how state and tribal authorities who steward forests in present-day Maine perceive barriers to climate change adaptation. And barriers are defined as factors that limit adaptation, but that are surmountable with effort. And if we can understand these barriers in a more kind of deep way, then we can try and create solutions for these barriers to be overcome. And my second research goal is to evaluate how state and tribal agencies use different types of knowledge, such as scientific, indigenous, or observational knowledge, to address climate change adaptation and learn how different types of knowledge could be bridged to enhance lasting collaborations among state and tribal authorities in present-day Maine. Bridging knowledge is defined as maintaining the integrity of each knowledge system while creating settings for two-way exchange for mutual learning. Given the kind of scope and extreme nature of climate change and how rapidly it's affecting systems, we want to be able to preserve as much knowledge as we can. In Maine, the Wabanaki have been adapting to environmental change for generations, and so we want to make sure we can capture that knowledge and understand if that knowledge is being used by different groups that are looking to adapt. And this is a really beautiful basket. This is Gabriel Frey, who's a Wabanaki basket maker. Just wanted to highlight here, and it's a knowledge system that is definitely very important to the people there. Now, my research design, I'm going to be running interviews, and I'm starting with participant selection. So I'm using key informant approaches that's selecting some key individuals kind of at the beginning of the study that I'm going to start reaching out to and interviewing. And then using snowball sampling. So after each of those key informant interviews, I ask that person if they can recommend other individuals, and it kind of snowballs the sample from there and gets bigger. We get more people involved. The selection criteria is their affiliation with a state or tribal agency, awareness or interest in the topic, and their role in the forestry field and regional distribution across Maine. Sending in invitations over email, and over recruiting for the sessions by 10 to 25%, just to make sure that we get enough participants in the study. The study is being guided by free, prior, and informed consent. So this applies specifically to Indigenous peoples and has to do with their ability to participate. They can withdraw at any time when they're part of the study. It's sort of about serving them and making them as they have total free reign over how they participate and when they participate. And I'll go into participant compensation a little bit further on here. So there's two parts to data collection. It starts with a questionnaire. This is going to have 14 questions. It's pretty much just demographic information, meant to be quite brief, so that there's not a big kind of expectation or toll on the participant. I'm asking a little bit about knowledge systems, demographics, and then if they want to suggest any additional participants. It's going to take about 10 minutes for them to complete. The prerequisite to their participation. And then that's followed by an interview. Interviews are a great participatory research method. So it's about getting people involved in the study who are also affected by the problems that the study is looking to deal with and to provide some suggestions for. They're going to be semi-structured. So I'll have 12 thematic questions, but also will leave room to probe with additional questions as the interview goes on. They'll take about 60 to 90 minutes. And the goal is to get about 20 to 25 interviews total, so about 10 people from state agencies, 10 people from tribal nations. Eligibility, 18 years or older, work for a state or tribal agency, and are engaged in forest-related management. And to show reciprocity for the knowledge and wisdom that's being shared in the study, we're offering $150 honorarium for tribal agency participants and continuing education credit provided by the Society of American Foresters. All study results will be shared with participants in the study and kind of the community at large. All data collected from the study is going to be held in perpetuity by the participating tribal nations. And we hope that the study results will help to offer recommendations to overcome barriers to climate change adaptation, to enhance collaboration between state and tribal agencies, to inform decision-making and policy-making in present-day Maine, and to inform future outreach, education, funding, and research efforts. This project is part of work that's already happening at the University of Maine, and it's been happening for decades. And so this project is meant to kind of just be one additional piece to a wide range of projects that my collaborators are already working on. And with that, I just want to give thanks again to my advisors, Anthony D'Amato and Rachel Shotman, committee members, Sherry Morris and Claire Ginger, my collaborators at the University of Maine, Darren Ranko, Adam Dinyo, Tyler Everett, and Tessa McGann and Matt Williamson, who have just guided me personally throughout this work. That's it. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you'd have you so far in like your research have gotten any resistance from like private parties or like the state of Maine?
There's been like questions about the amount of land owning for the people that I am working with. So in Maine, most of the land is owned in private ownership, whether that's like industry or just private landowners. And so questions about the validity of the work based on only working with tribal nations and state sectors. But I think overall, they've been pretty open to wanting to collaborate. And there's already like movement in Maine for, especially on the state side, to be bringing more tribal voices into their decision making.
So really important topic, and just curious about whether in your questionnaire, you said you had 12 questions that were going to be in your questionnaire. Have you developed those yet, those questions? And so do you have any expectations about what you're going to find with that questionnaire a priori? No, you haven't done it yet. Do you have any expectations about, so a hypothesis, about what you're going to see coming back in that questionnaire?
So the study is ongoing. So I have had some interviews and I have sent out the questionnaire.
Okay.
In terms of expectations, I think, the kind of main question I'm asking is, do you like strongly agree or strongly disagree that climate change is a major threat to forests in Maine? My expectation would be that they strongly agree. Although there's sort of like strongly agree and then there's agrees, there's different levels of that among people who are all working in forests in Maine. And then in terms of most of it's just demographic information. So in terms of trends I'm going to see in demographics, I'm not sure yet what's gonna come up. Yeah.
For the nations that you're working with, do they have input over what information is released from the study and kind of do that?
Yeah, so I am recording all of the interviews and then we are like making transcripts based on the interviews, and then I'm sending the transcripts back to each of the participants from tribal nations so they can review the transcript and make sure they can redact anything if they want to redact from it. In terms of input, that's sort of like the first part of it. And then as the study goes on and I'm like coming up with my own conclusions, I'm going to do like interim report outs and share it with all participants so they can come back and say, yeah, that sounds along the lines of what I was thinking, or no, that's definitely not what I meant. And then all the study results will be shared out in ways like I'm asked one of my interview questions is what would be the most effective communication tool for me to come up with at the end of the study. And so using that information to come up with more sort of like communication friendly, user friendly material outside of just a thesis document that could be useful to them. Yeah, please.
I was particularly interested in the bridging knowledge piece of this. I was wondering whether any of your questions or any of your interviews so far are giving you any insight into the willingness of either community to think about the other's knowledge. So what's the opportunity for finding bridging knowledge?
Yeah, so far I've just interviewed with folks from tribal nations, and what I've found is that there's a lot of loss of knowledge, which is kind of a sad thing to hear people talk about. I think just over time, the knowledge, you know, lost, whether it's like people being sent to special schools, you know, 100 years ago and being assimilated and losing their language, or just being like, I talked to someone recently who was like, I was a teenager and I didn't care what my grandfather was trying to tell me about, you know, how to harvest things, or, you know, stories about the salmon. So I think that there is definitely a desire to bridge knowledge, but how well that knowledge is preserved and how much knowledge is there, I think is hard, and just finding the right people in the community to be like those like wisdom holders to share, I think it's been hard within the tribes. And so I'm imagining that must be an even harder challenge for the state to try and do. But I guess I'll find more out as I interview more people.
So I'm kind of curious if you have, like, it's sort of an expectation question again, different expectations about where you might see differences in the adaptation gap, and what you might do with that information afterwards, like how much one group over the other has differences in terms of their adaptation gap, how much you address that.
I think part of the work is just starting a dialogue. I kind of look at this as, if I can like create a conversation between people from the state and people from tribal nations, like through my work, then, and like put the information out there, then hopefully that helps to like blossom further collaboration moving forward. I think what I anticipate is that there's a lot more like bureaucratic hoops that people from tribal nations have to go through in order to make decisions about adaptation, and also issues when it comes to funding availability, and just being like a community that is not like only 2 of the tribal nations in Maine have forestry departments. And so if you're just a natural resource department and you're trying to manage water and land and all of these different things, I think it's harder to probably you know, put funding aside and like allocate resources towards, for this study, particularly like forest management decisions. So I would probably anticipate that would be a challenge. If I answered your question, but okay. Yeah.
How are you as a researcher holding like the complexities of things like trust and power dynamics and land ownership, and all those really between 2 entities that have been, you know, where they've been a lot of complex and really into history, especially in one direction.
Yeah.
So how are you as a researcher sitting in that, and who are you reaching out to supports?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been hard, and I feel very aware of that throughout all of the work, and I'm kind of relying on collaborators and connections and people that have been really kind to work with me to sort of help bridge those relationships. And like I mentioned, this is part of like a lot of research that's happening at the University of Maine. They're one of the top universities in the country when it comes to Native American studies programs, and working with Indigenous groups and having representation for Indigenous people. And so building this work on like something that's like on something that's already happening. And this whole project was developed with me like going and having lots and lots of meetings with people who work for the state and people that work that are like professors at the university that work with the tribes and are community members within the tribes themselves, and just asking them what they need. And is this work, is this the right question? Would this be helpful if I came out with this research? Would they care about it? Would this help them get funding for additional research? So I think just like always being humble that I am, you know, just a master's student from Vermont trying to do this work in another state and wanting to just be of service through the work is just how I try to come at it from the research perspective, and just to really like hear from the community.
Did you initially have a connection with Maine, or is your relationship with Maine sort of developing through this research? I was curious if you were from Maine or.
I'm not from Maine. We wanted to do work with tribal nations, and Maine in the like New England context was the best place to do this work, and has these 5 like federally recognized tribal nations. And they're already part of these conversations about climate change adaptation and work that's going on. So it seemed like it was a good like addition to what they're already doing. Okay, thank you.
So our next presenter is Kate Longfield. Before we get started, just another reminder for those of you online, feel free to submit questions via the chat and we will read those out and get those answered. So Kate is originally from Cambridge, Massachusetts, although she considers Vermont home. She's currently a second-year master's student specializing in both agricultural science and environmental law. Kate has worked on a range of water quality issues in Vermont as a stormwater planner for Franklin and Grand Isle counties, planner for the Vermont Land Trust, and currently as a program manager for the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. At the moment, Kate is most interested in human relationships and how trust and communication impacts our lives, as well as our land use decisions. Her research explores farmers' trusts of government agencies and their enrollment in government conservation programs. When she's not doing research or schoolwork, you can find Kate exploring Vermont, whether by foot or by ski. Kate, the floor is yours.
Cool. Okay, awesome. All right, so thanks for the introduction, Katie. My name is Kate Longfield, and I am studying the influence of governmental trust on farmers' willingness to enroll in government conservation programs in Vermont's Lake Champlain Basin. My advisor is Chris Stepnick, and I'm funded through the Lake Champlain Sea Grant and the Watershed Forestry Partnership. So I wanted to start by just giving a really quick overview of Vermont's Lake Champlain, or the Lake Champlain Basin, because my work is geographically focused on Vermont's Lake Champlain Basin. The basin, this is just like a quick drawing that I did, but the basin bridges Vermont and New York and even a little bit into Quebec. And the really key thing here is that, I mean, you all are aware of watersheds, but all the lands in this watershed drain eventually into Lake Champlain. So that is really key. And I just wanted you to see the scale of the basin when I talk about my work. So whether you're in the social sciences or the natural sciences, trust and communication in natural resource management is incredibly important. Vermont most of the land in Vermont is owned by private landowners. I think Rachel had mentioned even with Maine too. And so being able to have, so for whether you're working with forests or in water quality, being able to communicate to landowners about different management techniques and different things like that and conservation practices is really important. And trust on the side of the landowner, like trust of the organizations that are trying to work with them to manage their land, that is really important too. So why research farmers' relationships with governmental agencies? So this is my project. This is the focus of my work. And this is something I'm really excited about and really interested in. Farmers are stewards of the land, and they are more often than not really open to the idea of implementing conservation practices on their properties, but they are also running businesses, and the idea of having to, for example, with forested riparian buffers, the idea of having to take some of their most fertile land, acres of it, out of production and plant trees and shrubs and grasses. They might be really excited about that idea to prevent erosion and improve water quality, but them having to do all the physical work and the labor and pay for that all out of their own pocket, like that is just not realistic for most farmers, especially in Vermont. So that is where government agencies come in, because the biggest, if a farmer is not going to pay out of their own pocket and implement these conservation practices, the next thing they're going to turn to are these government conservation programs. So that is these like agricultural agencies. So the USDA's Farm Service Agency works closely with farmers on this, the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, and then Vermont's Agency of Agriculture are some of the biggest government agencies that work with farmers to implement conservation practices. And these government conservation programs, there's a huge range of them, but these are a really key part of conservation in agriculture in Vermont. So I'm also sort of focusing on forested riparian buffers. I do a lot of work with farmers on different conservation practices, but forested riparian buffers are one of our best tools for improving water quality and erosion, and they're just an amazing resource that we have in Vermont and that we're improving. This is an example of a buffer on a farm. This sort of leads to my research question, which is, how does the level of trust that Vermont farmers have in government agencies influence their willingness to enroll in government conservation programs? So really brief overview, my research, like Rachel's, is qualitative in nature. I'm focusing on dairy, livestock, crop, and diversified farms in Vermont's Lake Champlain Basin. I'm going to be doing a random sample, which I'll talk about more soon. And my method is semi-structured interviews. So I wanted to just really quickly touch on my literature review and a couple of key parts of that. I did a really in-depth review and research of different human decision-making theories around implementing conservation practices. There's a ton of research on these different theories that are listed. And just in general, there's a huge body of literature on farmer adoption of conservation practices and farmer adoption of forested riparian buffers. So that is really, it's cool that there's a ton of knowledge on that has been developing over the last 10 to 15 years and even longer. But the thing that I really noticed was majorly lacking was there is not very much research on the role of governmental trust and how trust in these agencies influences farmers' willingness to enroll in these programs. There's maybe 2 studies that have talked about this briefly and have said we need more research on this. So that is what I'm really focusing on. So I said before, I'm going to do a random sample of farms in the Lake Champlain Basin. This is really interesting because qualitative research, doing a random sample in qualitative research is really uncommon. Like, it's pretty rare. So I wanted to kind of push myself as a qualitative researcher, and I also just really wanted to do a random sample because I'm only doing about 20 interviews with farmers, and I wanted to be able to generalize my findings across the entire basin. And I thought that would be really helpful for the agencies that I'm going to be able to share my results with. So in order to do a random sample, you need to have a list of all of the entire population within that you're going to be sampling from. So that would be a list of all dairy, livestock, crop, and diversified farms, diversified vegetable farms in the Lake Champlain Basin. That list does not exist. That is not something you can just pull up on Google. So this was an enormous challenge that I just created for myself to develop a database to create this list of farms in the Lake Champlain Basin. So I ended up building this database, and I have over 1,100 farms in it. I'm intentionally excluding this list of farms because I wanted to focus on farms that don't already have trees as a part of the agricultural landscape, because I'm focusing on forested riparian buffers. And the really challenging thing with creating this list is, as I talked about previously, the Lake Champlain Basin is not a straightforward boundary. The boundary cuts through counties and towns and even cuts through farms. So I really took advantage of the Lake Champlain Basin Program's Atlas, which is this interactive map where you can literally see the satellite, you can see specific farm fields. So if I was checking okay, such and such farm is really on the border, and I can zoom in and literally see is this farm within the basin or not in the basin. So this sort of leads to my farmer interviews. So I am going to be conducting about 20 interviews with these farmers that I select from. I'm working with statistics experts at UVM to make sure my sample is really random. And I had to go through UVM's institutional review board because I'm working with human subjects. So that's something I'm going through right now. And I wanted to just just because my interviews are the heart of my research and my project, I wanted to just quickly go over sort of the questions, the type of questions and the content that I'm going to be asking farmers about. I think I have about I think I have like 10 questions. I don't have the exact number on the top of my head, but basically I have the farmer first talk about, and I've done 2 sort of pilot practice interviews, one with a dairy farmer and one with a livestock farmer, which was really good to just sort of figure out, like, are these questions working, and sort of get some feedback about my questions. So first I had the farmer talk about their farm and any waterways that run through their fields or property. Then I asked them about government conservation programs. So I have them talk about their familiarity with programs, whether they've previously enrolled in a program, if they're currently enrolled in a program, and just what their thoughts are on these programs in general. Then I asked them about forested riparian buffers, if they have buffers on their property, if they do, if the buffers were implemented through a program, and just what their thoughts are on forested buffers as a conservation practice on farms in general. Then I really dived into the idea of trust with these agencies. So the 3 agencies that I'd mentioned before are the USDA's Farm Service Agency, the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. So those are the 3 agencies that I'm focusing on for this research. So basically I work through these agencies one by one. I start with NRCS, then do FSA and Vermont Agency of Ag. And I ask these farmers about how often they've worked with these agencies and the staff, how that experience was, and sort of what their thoughts are on the agency in general, and then what their trust, I had them rate their trust of this agency using a Likert scale. So I can sort of compare farmers' answers across my interviews. I've had the first 2 farmers checked, they were sort of asking what I was meaning by trust. And when I'm thinking about trust, I want the farmer to sort of interpret it. But if they ask me, I say that it's basically faith and competency of the agency. That's sort of what I'm meaning by trust. And then I finished by asking them about their trust using the same Likert scale of the federal government, and also their trust, just general trust of the Vermont state government. And that has been really interesting. One thing that I have people often ask me about is politics, because politics plays a really big part in people's trust of the government. I don't bring up politics at all during the interview, but if a farmer brings it up, that's interesting. That's interesting for my data that I will be able to code later. So I am recording and transcribing all of my interviews with Otter AI, which is an app. And I used it for the first 2 practice interviews. That was really helpful. It does a really good job. And then I'm going to use NVivo, which is a software for coding and analyzing interviews. It's really common in qualitative research. And I've used that before with a class. So this is where the hours and hours and hours of work comes in for qualitative researchers, because coding your interviews and pulling out themes and reading through these interviews is so, it involves just such rigor and so much care. So it's going to be sort of the hardest part, but I'm really excited because that's where all the themes are going to start to emerge of what I'm sort of finding. Then I'm sharing my results with a bunch of different water quality organizations in Vermont. I am friends with both the head of the Vermont Farm Service Agency and the head of Vermont, the new head of Vermont's NRCS. And I've talked to them both in person, and they're really excited about my research and the results. And even though they're running these big federal agencies, changing how they run is not going to be easy. I think that being able to share what farmers, how farmers are feeling about the way that they communicate and work with these agencies, I think is going to be helpful, even if they can't immediately change the way they're running their programs. I think it's useful for them. I also threw up this little picture over there the Watershed Forestry Partnership has a really cool podcast about forested riparian buffers called Restoration Roundup. And I'm featured on for the first 10 minutes of their latest episode that came out just like 2 days ago. So if you want to hear more about my research, you can go check that out. It's on Spotify and kind of anywhere you get podcasts. Now I'm going to be publishing my research to a journal and yeah. So what might my results look like? So I'm currently the program manager for the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. So I spend a lot of my time talking and working with dairy and livestock farmers in Vermont. So that's what I'm doing when I'm not thinking about dairy and livestock farmers with my research. So even though I haven't started my interviews officially, I have talked to farmers about my work a lot and have been able to sort of think about what I might end up finding. So these are sort of the 4 biggest things that I think might come up. The first thing is farmer agency communication. So this has come up, a bunch of farmers have brought this up with me. If a farmer, for example, is getting a ton of mail from NRCS, for example, and they would really prefer to just be able to talk to the NRCS staff in person, and they would just like to have the staff come out and talk to them at their farm, but they're just getting letter after letter after letter. They're feeling like it's really impersonal, and that's not the way that they want to be communicated with. They would prefer if the staff came out to their farm. Vice versa, if an NRCS staff is just continually showing up for these visits at the farm and a farmer is just that's not the way they want to talk to, they would prefer just getting mail. Like that is really important for agencies to know, because if you are being communicated with, it's kind of like a love language. Like if you're being communicated with in a way that you don't want to, then that can degrade trust. Like you might feel like, okay, this staff member is just being really impersonal. They're just sending me mail. I want them to just come out. So that would have to be like really, it'd be a lot of work for an agency to sort of see a case by case, like what farmer prefers what, but I think that's really important. Conflicts between agencies. So this is something that's happening right now in Vermont. The Agency of Agriculture and the Agency of Natural Resources are really having some serious conflicts over jurisdiction over wetlands, especially on farms. And I've had this come up in one of the practice interviews I did. The farmer was feeling like they are super aware that there's conflict between these agencies and within these agencies. And they were saying that if the agencies were speaking more through the same voice or with the same message, and it was more like streamlined kind of, they would be more trusting of these agencies. But because they can tell that the agencies are not communicating and that they're sending different mixed messages, that is actually eroding trust from the farmers. Another thing is farmers. So some farmers, like if a farmer grew up and went to school with someone who is now working at the Farm Service Agency in Williston, they might be more willing, might be more trusting of that agency because they're like, oh, I'm just going to call up Joe and see like if they have any money for me to implement a buffer. Like, so that is really, and some, there's farms in Vermont that are like 7+ generational farms. And so some of these families have long established relationships with agencies and with specific staff. So that can really help trust. And then the last thing is knowledge sharing networks. Farmers are really good at this. Farmers are more trusting of, and this came up in the literature and just through talking to them, farmers are more trusting of each other than they are of government agencies, like across the board. And so farmers often will just sort of naturally form these sort of knowledge sharing networks of, like when something, so this is an example, I put up the organization I work for, the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, because the entire organization was created in, I think it was 2014, when the Agency of Agriculture was releasing required agricultural practices, RAPs for farmers, and farmers were getting really stressed out and they were like, we have to suddenly do all these different practices and we don't really know what to do. And so farmers were just talking to each other so much during that time. And they found that talking to each other and having these different like ways of sharing information was so helpful that they ended up creating this entire nonprofit that is literally the entire purpose is to help farmers share knowledge and implement conservation practices and improve water quality. And so that is just an example of that is how, like farmers often will just be more trusting and more willing to communicate when they're working together. So that's just sort of an interesting thing that's come up. But yeah, I really don't know what's going to fully come up from my interviews, and I'm really excited. So that is everything I have right now. Thanks. So questions? Yes.
I thought immediately when you talked about the giant database that you have, that you went over it very quickly and thought you deserved a moment to get to talk more about this massive database that you made. So I'd love to hear more about like what went into making that.
Yeah. I know during the podcast episode that I was on, my Allison Adams, who's interviewing me, was like, wait, that's like a thesis. Like, what do you, that's like one step. And the funny thing about that I just have been kind of laughing with my partner about is I built this entire database to be able to say that my research is a random sample because I wanted to do a random sample. But literally I put in hours and hours of work to literally have 2 words in a published paper, random sample. Like that is a lot of work for just being able to say that it was a random sample. But yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's all in Excel. I think I have like 1,150 something farms. And I'm pretty close to, I sort of quiz myself. Like if I'm driving past a farm, I will like write it down, go home, search in my database. I'm like, yep, I obviously have Footprint Farm or whatever it is. Like so I sort of, if you want to quiz me and have me make sure that I have all the farms, like you can do that. Yeah, so because it's not the entire state, it's just the basin, and because I didn't include a lot of these other farms, I actually think I'm pretty close to the actual number. And I've talked to like the Farm Service Agency staff, and they're like, what do you mean? Like what? Like that list, like when I was talking about the fact that I was doing a random sample, like people that know what a random sample is are like, no, you're not. Like, how are you doing a random sample? You would have to have a list. It's like, yeah, I have the list. But yeah, I mean, it's not gonna be perfect too. Like I'm gonna miss farms, and I'm gonna probably have some like homesteads that aren't technically farms, but I'm doing my best. I'm human, and yeah, I'm really proud of it. Hyla.
So how did you define a farm? And then how did you find them all?
So I defined a farm originally just from like the census definition. I forget the exact definition off the top of my head, but it's about income and like how much money a farm is taking in from what they're producing. And I found the farms it was all from online publicly available information. So I was like legally allowed to just build this database online. I was able to sort of get some feet up by using, there were different organizations that like through my crazy like internet stalking searching, I was able to find like, oh my gosh, this organization, like, Farm to Table or something already has a spreadsheet of like, a bunch of like all the vegetable farms in like Franklin County or whatever, like just different sort of things. So I was able to sort of piece things together. So it wasn't literally just like Googling, but it was a lot of just like Googling and like just having a bunch of screens open and like having my spreadsheet and like just a lot of searching and like zooming in within the boundary. Like I had pulled up the Lake Champlain Basin Program map and really like making sure that these farms are within the basin. But it's hard to describe. It was just like a labor of love. It was just, I'm good at internet stalking. So I was like, all right, I can do this. Like I can put this to use. Yeah.
So first off, thank you for sharing like your very apparent passion for your research. And I was wondering what your hopes are for use of your research results in the future.
Yeah. So like I said, I've talked to the heads of Vermont's Farm Service Agency and Natural Resource Conservation Service. I also have friends in the Agency of Ag that are interested in this. So the big thing is to just share these results with these agencies. Because really, I'm not asking any of the farmers to change what they're doing in terms of trust and communication. Like that is the responsibility of these agencies to like communicate with farmers the way that they want to be communicated with, and to the agency to build trust with the farmers. So I'm going to really like the recommendations I have are going to be for the agencies. I'm really connected with farmer groups in Vermont, so I'm going to share my work with the farmers. but I really just want to, yeah, just like share my findings about the importance of trust. I don't know. Mostly in like most of what I'm sharing is just in Vermont, but I'm going to try to publish, and so it'll be outside Vermont. But yeah. That
was kind of my question is do you think that this can be sort of extrapolated to other states, or do you think this is very regional in terms of the findings?
Yeah, so the findings are like, the findings will specifically be, I'm able to generalize to the entire basin because it's a random sample. I can't even officially generalize to the state of Vermont because I'm just doing the random sample within the Lake Champlain Basin. But I think that a lot of what I'm going to end up finding can definitely apply to the entire state of Vermont, and then also apply to other states in the country, probably states that have a really, are really like agriculturally active would be the most interested in the findings. But yeah, I think this is important, and I would love to see other studies across the country come up that are sort of similar to this. Yeah.
Do all the farms that you're looking at, do they all have potential riparian areas for planting, or does it matter to you?
It doesn't. So because I'm doing a random sample, I don't know what I'm not specifically sort of cherry picking farms that have buffers. Most farms have, I spend a lot of time on farms. Most farms have streams and rivers running through their fields. That's sort of what helps make them fertile and the soils. But it's sort of so one big thing is that because of, I talked about how the organization was formed because of the Agency of Ag's required agricultural practices. So the RAPs in Vermont actually require all farms to have different sort of buffers. So they have to have 25-foot perennial vegetation on all, like, I think it's perennial and intermittent streams. So like some buffers already have to exist in Vermont. And I don't think, I'm sure not every farm is following it. But so farmers are aware of buffers. They're aware that they need some buffers. But what I'm really thinking about is 50-foot. So when I talk about forested riparian buffers, I'm really thinking about like 50-foot forested riparian buffers. So like trees are planted. It's not just like a grassed filter strip. But yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm going to ask them about buffers. So I'll ask them if they have buffers on their property, what they think about them. And there's a range. Like some farmers are like, I've talked to so many farmers that are like, one farmer that was really interesting was talking about how his grandfather and all of his brothers had pulled every rock and tree out of their fields. And we were literally standing looking across the field. He was like, and he got like physically emotional. It was like the idea of replanting even just like little strips along this river. Like, I love my grandfather too much. Like that memory will be affected. Like I can't. I was like, this is such an interesting reason why he's opposed to buffers. Like people like teachings at Rubenstein, like people aren't usually talking about like the familial memory and like how that is the reason why people are opposed to buffers. So there's a lot of different reasons. Yeah.
It was an amazing talk, really nice talk. I have a methodological question. I think it's a great idea to do random sampling. But the question is, why just 20 farms? And how do you know that if you do a random sampling, that 20 farms are not going to be just 20 dairy farms? You know, where these 20 is coming from?
Yes. So I've talked to my advisor about this a bunch because she was like, since you built this database, it's kind of a bummer that you're only doing 20 interviews. Like you could be doing a ton of like questionnaires and getting way more information. I wanted to do interviews because I'm really interested in like getting really like an in-depth, just really unpacking sort of the issue of trust instead of getting sort of like a wide sample. 20 because 20 is sort of a commonly recognized amount of interviews to reach saturation, which basically means any more interviews you do, new themes won't really emerge. So 20 interviews is kind of like, in this sort of field, it's assumed that like 20 is a really good amount to be able to collect all of the different themes that you're kind of looking for. But I do think that moving forward, like I'm not going to make my database public. I'm going to kind of keep that to myself, but I think I'm going to kind of keep it within Rubenstein and have my advisor and people sort of work with that. And I think my advisor is really excited about the idea of having other students maybe do larger like questionnaires or something using that database. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? It's maybe the other side of the question. just asked. So you were excluding some sort of farm types, but you're including four. From memory, it was dairy and livestock and crop and vegetable activity. Do you think there's the possibility that those different groups might respond differently in the survey? And with 20 interviews, and I know how hard it is to get one interview, so I get it that 20 is hard to get. But would 20 give you enough power to be able to detect that difference in the system?
Yeah, so that just reminded me of the last part of your question that I didn't answer, which is like, what if you just get all 20 dairy farmers or something? So that, I mean, because this is, I'm doing a random sample, I should get a random sample. So if you're shaking your head.
You should.
I should, in theory. So right. I might just get a bunch of small, I might get Burnt Rock and Pitchfork Farm, and I might get a bunch of small vegetable farms or whatever. So that is, I guess that's part of this, that's a risk. And yes, I absolutely think that the different types of farms will have different sort of perspectives. These government agencies mostly work with dairy and livestock farms and like crop, sort of like these bigger farms. They are not usually working with small vegetable farms. That's like, I've talked to a lot of NRCS staff and they're like, we're not usually working with small vegetable farms. I wanted to include them because I was actually really curious what vegetable farmers have, like if they've worked with these different agencies and if they've thought about buffers. But yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting what, like, if I get who sort of I end up interviewing. And yeah, there's going to be different answers and it's not going to be perfect. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I still wonder about focusing on one of the larger impact types of farms and randomly sampling within that, and just admitting that at this, you maybe have a whole career here that you might be working on. And so as a first step in this, rather than complicating by having multiple farm types, to have one farm type and to randomly sample within that strata of farms.
Yeah, no, I had thought about just doing dairy or just doing livestock. I'd submitted to get a grant, and I had said I was just focusing on livestock farms, and they said part of the reason why I didn't get the grant was because they felt like that was like way too narrow, and I needed to kind of look at more broad. I maybe took that too seriously. It's not too late. Like I could just focus on dairy and livestock, and I've thought about that a lot. But yeah, I don't know. I would love to talk more about that. All right, I'm probably way over my time. Is there this? You can talk to me after. Thank you.
All right. So, our final presenter this evening is Maria Alfaro, who is a second-year master's student from Ithaca, New York. She attended SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York, for her undergraduate studies in aquatic and fisheries science. Before graduating in 2019, she spent a semester abroad through the Sea Education Association program, taking marine-focused courses and sailing across the Lesser Antilles to conduct research on the antioxidant kinetics of coral species. She worked at the Stroud Water Research Center in Avondale, Pennsylvania, in the entomology lab before starting her master's at UVM. She's advised by Mindy Morales-Williams and is interested in understanding the anthropogenic influences on biogeochemical processes in freshwater ecosystems. When she's not doing research or schoolwork, you can find her climbing or snowboarding. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, thank you, Katie, so much. And that was such a great talk, Kate. You are so passionate. That's amazing. And my talk is just downstream of Kate's work. We were just talking about how it's connected, but my focus is aquatic. And the title of my research is Influence of Artificial Aeration on nutrient limitation and nitrogen fixation in Eutrophic Lake Carmi, Vermont. And I recognize that this is a mouthful, as most research titles are, and so I'm going to break this down as much as I can, especially for people in the audience. I think there are some NR1 students here. I'm going to start with the term nutrient limitation. When we're talking about nutrient limitation, what's being limited? What are nutrients limiting? We're talking about primary productivity. And so in the most basic of terms, we're talking about, we mean that phytoplankton would grow more if we had more nutrients. So for example, in a system that is nitrogen limited, which is a specific type of nutrient, you would, if you added nitrogen, you would see an increase in phytoplankton or primary productivity. And to take that a step further, if you added phosphorus and you saw an even greater increase in primary productivity, then that would be nitrogen-phosphorus co-limitation. Okay, so synthesizing all of this background leads me to my first research question, which is, has nutrient limitation of primary production changed in Lake Carmi post-aeration, and does this vary seasonally? So I think it's a great opportunity that the experiment that Volponi et al. Had conducted was right before aeration had been deployed, and so I want to look at how aeration has affected this, and while I'm at it, see if there's a seasonal variation to nutrient limitation. And my second research question is more inspired by the last bit of background that I shared about nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria and also management strategies for nitrogen. And my question is, to what extent do nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria contribute to nitrogen cycling in Lake Carmi? And So we've seen an increase in summer nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria. Does this have an impact on nitrogen fixation rates? And is this a significant contribution to the end pool? So in order to answer these questions, I have paired observational experimental data, and observationally, I have environmental biological parameters. I've collected nutrient concentrations, total nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrate, ammonium, phosphate, and I've collected chlorophyll A, which is a parameter or an indicator of primary productivity, collected phytoplankton to characterize the assemblages, and there's also a high-frequency buoy on Lake Carmi as they're monitoring the progress or the success of it aerating the water column. So I have access to these data, which I'm very grateful for. And this measures dissolved oxygen, temperature, and other parameters. So, and in addition to these, I'm also conducting 2 experiments, and a nutrient limitation experiment, like the other experiments I've referenced. And I'm also doing an acetylene reduction assay, which is used to calculate nitrogen fixation rates. And I'll go over those. This is an overview of my methods. I've actually grabbed this for a poster that I'm presenting at a conference next week. So luckily I have this graphic. I'll walk you through this, but this is basically just a flow chart of the 2 experiments. And so the first experiment, the nutrient limitation assay, is basically first it just collected a lot of water and filtered zooplankton out of it, because otherwise they would have eaten all of my phytoplankton by the time I got back to the lab. So with this water, I spike it with different nutrient combinations, which I've listed here, and then put it in glorified Ziploc bags. They're called Vitrin bags, but yeah, I'll probably reuse them to put my sandwiches in or something. And then once I have those and the replicates, I ask for help to put these into handmade PVC floating racks. And I've got those randomly assigned beforehand, and then put them in the racks and then float them. And you might recognize this location, but it's right outside of the Rubenstein Ecosystem Science Lab. And once they're out there, then I incubate them for 7 days. And I check on them, otherwise sometimes they float away. And the last picture is just once they've incubated for 7 days, I process them for chlorophyll A, and I also take a phytoplankton subsample to look at the assemblage later. And then so for the acetylene reduction assay, the methods are a little bit newer to me and more complicated, very technical. So the pictures aren't as glamorous, but the first picture is creating the acetylene gas, which I did by combining calcium carbide and deionized water in Breck's lab Puma, because ours is down. And then once you have the acetylene gas, you inject your water, the water that I've collected from Lake Carmi, in a capped and crimped serum vial, and then inject it with the acetylene gas, displace the water into a different syringe, and then incubate that for 4.5 hours. Once that's incubated, I subsample the headspace, and then I'll measure that for ethylene, because acetylene is transformed to ethylene by nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. So it's an indicator of nitrogen fixation rates. And then I use formulas to calculate those rates. So I still have to process the samples that I've collected over the summer, but so far I've analyzed the high-frequency buoy data, and I've created a couple of plots to share of the summer conditions for 2022. If you're unfamiliar with this form of graph, I can walk you through it. But so on the y-axis, there's depth. At the top, it's 0, and at the bottom, it's the maximum depth of the maximum depth sampled, which is 8.5 in this case. And we do this because then you can visualize it as a lake. The top is the surface of the lake, the bottom is the bottom. And then because this is high frequency, you have an x-axis from all the way from May to October. And you can imagine every single slice as one depth profile. So for example, it might be better to walk through certain days, but so like on this day in June, and for people on teams, I'm pointing to the June, it's completely green. So the column from the top to the bottom is all the same temperature. So you would call this not stratified. It's completely mixed. It's all the same water, kind of. And then so to contrast that, because the rest of this whole summer was very, very well mixed thermally. Let's take between May and June for people on teams. The top, if you take one slice, which is like a day, the top is green, which is between 15 and 20 degrees. But then you have a discrete layer of about 15 degrees and then a bottom water that's about 10 degrees. And that's stratification starting to set in, but then it's interrupted before you get to June. And the white marks, or the white dots, mark my sampling dates so far. Maybe I can get one more sampling day in November. And so this is the same type of plot, so same orientation, but instead of water temperature, we have dissolved oxygen. And this graph is really interesting because the purple marks on the bottom mark anoxic or hypoxic events. So the goal of the aeration system is to keep that sediment-water interface oxygenated so that phosphorus isn't re-released into the water column. And it failed to do so this past summer according to these data. And in previous years, there has been electrical or system malfunctions where the complete system just shut off, and this also happened. So that it will be interesting to analyze the effects of those later. And then one more graph, I have Schmidt stability, which is basically just to corroborate what I've said now. And Schmidt stability is a measure of how much energy it would take to mix the whole lake. And low Schmidt stability means that the whole lake is probably being mixed, and a high peak of Schmidt stability means that there's probably stratification. And so between May and June, there's this significant spike visually, and if you go back to the thermal graph, we have stratification starting to set up, so that lines up. And then this is the poster that I'm going to be presenting on this work next week in Lake George at a conference for lake scientists. And one more thing is, some things that I've been considering that I want to incorporate into my research. Maybe you guys have more questions about it, and maybe I do or do not have answers. But one of the first things is whether or not to run my nutrient concentration samples for organic nitrogen, because it's especially increasingly becoming important, or it's organic nitrogen is used as a fertilizer, and before it's been dismissed because it's not as easily assimilated into phytoplankton. It's not as bioavailable. But I think that it'd be interesting to investigate that because it still is assimilated, and that could be significant. But the process to analyze the nutrients is a little bit more complicated than analyzing for other nutrients. So we'll see about that. And then I also just wanted to say that being a nitrogen person is pretty hard because the nitrogen cycle is really complex. Different forms of nitrogen they transform really quickly, and there are a lot of things going on at once, and phosphorus gets a lot of attention. So I just wanted to mention that. All right, thank you, everybody. And thank you to everybody that helped me, and I'm sure I will have even more pictures on here when I'm presenting again later in the year. But this is my advisor, Mindy, and then we have everyone else in the lab. There's Marge, Lindsay, who's helped me with a lot of different parts of my research, Alex, another undergrad in our lab, Kate and Ismar, and Will, who's not in our lab, but volunteered to help me anyways. Anyone have questions? Yes, Lindsay.
What do you expect to see for like not only your bioassays, but as well as experiments? Do you have any like hypotheses?
Yeah, so just because the aeration system isn't going as expected, I'm holding on to hypotheses for now formally, but I do have ideas. And so because of these anoxic events that are happening anyways, even though the whole lake is being aerated, I think that will have an impact because that phosphorus can get re-released and then the whole lake is mixing again because the aeration system breaks down that stability and then pulses it back into the lake. And so as far as what nutrient is being limited, I have to think about that a little bit more. Well, I have some thoughts, but they're too preliminary for you guys. So, but I think that has certainly been great food for the blooms. Yeah.
What method are you using to separate out the zooplankton, and does it potentially create a problem with the larger filamentous?
Yes, yeah, that's an unfortunate trade-off. Is that I used a 420 micron filter sieve. It's like I think I probably have a picture of it, and the size of phytoplankton and zooplankton overlap. And so if you're going to get all the zooplankton, you're going to filter out phytoplankton and vice versa. So I probably did miss some colonies, but I think fragments of colonies pass through because 420 is actually a bigger size than other nutrient limitation experiments in the past have used. So I at least got colony fragments, and then those can obviously proliferate.
Yeah, that's a pretty big mesh size.
Yeah.
But have you thought about light mediated removal of plankton separate them?
Using light and dark? Yeah. I hadn't thought about that actually. Yeah, I'd like to talk to you more about that after. Although, like, yeah, I'm really attached to these.
I know you've already collected it, so I don't want to.
Well, like,
so that you know, there is a way to separate using light and dark.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm a master's student, so maybe for a PhD.
So following up on Lindsay's question, what do you expect? One thing that I noticed or did not get to see is what your plans are for statistical analysis.
Touchy question. The hardest class I'm taking currently. I'm going to be making some box plots, and I have to think about that more. To be really, really honest, yeah, statistics is not my forte.
I would be happy to sit and discuss your project.
If that's a genuine offer, I would absolutely take you up on that.
Consider this a genuine offer.
Perfect. Anybody else have a question? Yeah.
Just, I was really interested to know do you have pre-aeration data for the lake, and how different is that oxygen on those oxygen zones pre-aeration versus those events you're seeing?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Those aren't my data, but I would like to compare those as well. And I'm sure if I ask around, I can look at those.
Is it doing more mixing than it was? I mean, aeration can be more of a problem than solution, because it's a shallow system. It's going to bring nutrients that would normally be trapped in the hyperlimium. If you have one, it's a shallow lake, so there might not be a real strong one. But given what you showed for that density graph, the potential is there for that separation, and so that would seal off a good amount of nutrients during the growing season, whereas I think it would be fall mixing you worry about for blooms or something.
Yeah.
With constant mixing, you're allowing for all that nutrient that normally would get trapped, at least for the sun, to come back up.
Yeah, like the aeration system is almost doing the opposite of what it wanted to do, or like it yes, absolutely. And so the aeration system is based off of that one biogeochemical principle, which is a great one. My background is being I thought I was going to go to grad school and study phosphorus because I learned about the iron trap. So phosphorus re-release from the sediment, and that biogeochemical principle is so exciting and fun to think about. But designing a multi-million-dollar aeration system off of it, when there are other things at play, like if you're mixing the column, you're also, if there is re-release, like if it shuts off, or if there are these anoxic events anyways, the destabilizing the water column is just redistributing anything that is re-released. Yeah. If there are no more questions, I'll wrap up. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Thank you all for being here. I know it's the first place you wanted to be on a Friday night. Appreciate that you really came through. Folks online, thank you also for joining. Maria, special thank you and apologies for all the technical difficulties and interruptions, but you really carried on like a champ. Yeah, just wanted to thank you all again. Thank our presenters. We can get another round of applause for all of them. And so our presentations are done for the night. The plan now, for those of you that are here in person, we're going to open up those big doors back there, and there's some food and beverages and conversation to be had. So I'm going to direct folks that way to go grab some food and then come back. We're going to rearrange this space a little bit to allow for a bit more seating and conversation, but really invite you to stick around. And one final note, I'm going to challenge everyone. There are a lot of people here, a lot of people you might not know, but all presumably part of our Rubenstein community in some fashion. Want to challenge folks to maybe introduce yourself to someone you don't know, start a conversation, whether it's one of our presenters or another faculty, staff member, someone else. So take this time and opportunity to mingle. All right. Thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Katie.